This week, we'll be covering our first group of seed plants, the gymnosperms. Specifically, we will examine the shared characteristics of all seed plants, so that would include the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And then we'll take a closer look at the unique characteristics of just the gymnosperms. We'll focus on the pine life cycle in order to try to understand the gymnosperm life cycle in general. And then we'll focus on the different groups of gymnosperms globally with an emphasis on those that are found in the state of California. So specifically, we'll focus on the phylum Coniferophyta, Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, and Cnidophyta. So thus far, we've examined the non-vascular plants, which are the bryophytes. Recall that the bryophytes were not only non-vascular, but they didn't generate seeds. It included the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. And then we examined the seedless vascular plants. So that group included the lycophytes as well as the manilophytes. For the next few weeks, we'll be focused on the seed plants, or the spermatophytes. And this group includes both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So there are 5 phyla within this group. 4 out of those 5 phyla are gymnosperms. And all of the gymnosperms have naked seeds. And in fact, that's what the name gymnosperm means. So sperm means seed and gymno means naked. So when you look at a pine cone, for example, you see seeds exposed right on those scales that make up the woody cone. So it's like those little notches that make up the cone. They bear seeds that are not covered in a fruit. So angiosperms are the seed plants that do not produce naked seeds. The seeds of the angiosperms are developed inside of a fruit. And we'll talk more about the angiosperms in the next few weeks. But first I want to focus on the shared traits or characteristics of all of the seed plants. So this includes the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. All seed plants have separate male and female spores. We didn't see this in most of the non-vascular and seedless vascular plants, although some seedless vascular plants do have separate male and female spores. But in general, what we were seeing was just the production of spores. And those spores would go on to produce gametophytes that could produce both sperm and egg. But now in the seed plants, we see all of the organisms producing separate male spores that develop into the male gametophyte that just makes sperm, and separate female spores that develop into a female gametophyte that just makes the eggs. In all seed plants, those gametophytes are extremely small. So primarily what you think of when you think of seed plants, like the oaks and the pines and the daffodils, are the sporophyte generation. So the gametophytes are so small they never leave the spore walls, and you would need a microscope in order to see the gametophytes, both the male and female gametophytes of the seed plants. So as I mentioned, they're extremely small. The gametophytes are extremely small and they're retained within the spore walls. So in the case of the male gametophyte in the seed plants, it develops inside of the male spore, which is the pollen grain. In the case of the female gametophyte, it develops inside the megasporangium, which is inside a structure called the ovule. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ovule in just a minute. Two other shared traits of all seed plants are seeds, of course, and pollen. And I have a little bit more information about both of those structures as well. So seeds are a very special adaptation in seed plants that has allowed them to become the most successful group of plants on the planet. There are more seed plants than any other kind of plant. And the seeds, like this one that we see here, this is the ginkgo biloba seed, are produced from ovules. And ovules are the female sporangia, which generates the female spores, which generates the female gametophyte, which generates eggs, all inside a protective covering. So it's the female sporangia inside a couple of layers of a protective covering. The seed develops from this ovule after the egg inside gets fertilized from sperm. And the seed, as we see right here, includes the female sporangium tissue, and that would be everything from the embryo all the way out here to the seed coat. Those protective outer coating of the ovule eventually becomes the seed coat. So this is a protective covering that helps the seed avoid drying out, and it allows it to be protected from the elements, sometimes even allows it to be protected from getting digested in the digestive tract of an animal. And then of course the seed also includes the embryonic sporophyte, and that's what we see here. This is the next generation. So this represents a shift in the dispersal unit from the female spores to seeds. So in the seedless vascular plants, the spores were what was dispersed off of the sporophyte plant in order to ensure that offspring were generated. In this case, the plant retains those female spores inside the ovule, and instead a seed develops, and that's what's dispersed. So that's what leaves the mother plant in order to generate offspring. The seed has contributed to the success of the seed plants in many ways. So this is better than dispersing spores in many ways. For example, spores don't contain a coat, a protective seed coat, and they also don't include this nourishing tissue. This is a multicellular tissue. These are multicellular tissues. The spore is a single cell. In addition, seeds can be viable for longer than spores, and they also have great potential for long distance dispersal. So some seeds in the angiosperms can float, or they can fly on the wind, or they can be carried by an animal through its digestive tract, hundreds of miles or thousands of miles even. The next shared characteristic of the seed plants that we'll take a closer look at is the pollen. So these are the male spores, and they generate a gametophyte within that spore wall. So the male gametophyte is extremely small. It develops inside these spores or pollen grains. The pollen can be transported via the wind to the ovule. Remember, that's where the egg's going to be, and then that male gametophyte inside the pollen grain is going to generate the sperm. We call that pollination when the pollen reaches the ovule. There are many advantages of pollen over other means of reproduction that we've seen in other kinds of plants. First of all, it can be carried great distances, so it can be carried in the wind, or it can be carried by specialized animal pollinators. And second, it is not dependent on water for transport. So recall that the sperm of the bryophytes and the sperm of the seedless vascular plants had to swim through the environment in order to make it to the egg. So they required water. Whereas the pollen grain can be airborne or directly delivered by animal pollinators to the ovule and then grow into the egg. So it's not dependent on water like the sperm of the bryophytes and the seedless vascular plants were. Another bit of information about gymnosperm reproduction is that we find the pollen being produced in structures called pollen cones, and this is an image of the pollen cones in a pine, and the ovules are produced in woody ovulate cones. So here you can see these might actually already have developed into seeds, but on each of these scales, initially there would be ovules, 2 ovules per scale, in fact, and then after fertilization occurred, those ovules would develop into seeds. So we've got pollen cones and ovulate cones often on the same plant. Okay, so now I want us to take a look at the pine life cycle figure that was in your Boundless book. So in this figure, we can see that the diploid generation, or the sporophyte, is the portion of this life cycle that we're most familiar with. Recall that I said the gametophytes are easy to miss because they're microscopic. And so here we see that in general, we have the ovulate cones, or the female cones, higher up on the tree, and then the pollen cones, or the male cones, lower on the tree. So the male cones will produce the pollen, and the female cones will produce the ovules. Pollination occurs when the pollen grains fly up into the ovulate cone. And the idea is that outcrossing will occur so that the pollen from one individual makes it to the ovules of another in order to avoid inbreeding. But regardless, when that pollen reaches the ovule, that's called pollination. And recall that within the pollen grain, so the pollen grain is the spore, and within that grain, the multicellular gametophyte will develop. And that's where we see here in this diagram these sperm nuclei inside this growing pollen tube. So when the pollen reaches the ovule, it grows a little projection that allows it to deposit those sperm directly into the ovule. And recall that within the ovule, we have the female sporangium, which develops the female gametophyte, which will eventually give rise to the egg. So the sperm are delivered directly into the ovule, and then they fertilize the egg. And that's what restores the diploid sporophyte generation. So recall in that seed that I showed you of the ginkgo, the 2N sporophyte was that tiny little embryo inside, but not all of the tissues in the seed are going to be diploid. Remember that some of the seed is the megasporangium, so some of these tissues that were haploid. So there are a mixture of haploid and diploid tissues in those seeds. These seeds will germinate, and then we'll have eventually our next mature sporophyte generation. Now let's take a look at the diversity within the gymnosperms. There are about 840 species of gymnosperms globally, and that estimate varies a little bit between different sources. So about 840 species globally. That is not very many species. So in comparison, the other seed plants, the angiosperms, the estimates of angiosperm diversity are anywhere between 300 and 400,000 species. So they are relatively species poor. There aren't very many species of gymnosperm. All gymnosperms have ovules and seeds exposed in cone-like structures or stalks. So recall that was the feature that's described in the name, gymnosperm, naked seed. And then also recall that there are 5 phyla of seed plants, and 4 of those 5 phyla are gymnosperms. So we'll take a look at those 4 phyla in the next few slides. And those phyla are the Cnidophyta, the Coniferophyta, the Ginkgophyta, and the Cycadophyta. So first let's take a look at the conifers, the organisms that are classified within the phylum Coniferophyta. There are about 630 species of conifers globally, and Northern California is relatively diverse in conifers. So we have a pretty wide variety of conifers relative to most other places on the planet. These organisms aren't necessarily very diverse, but they can be incredibly ecologically important. So many of our common forest types around the globe are dominated by conifers. So that certainly includes the boreal forest. It also includes many different kinds of temperate forests, including temperate rainforests, and also the drier kinds of mixed conifer forests like the ones we have in California. This phylum also includes many commercially important species, so many gymnosperms, or rather conifers, are logged and used to build houses and furniture and all sorts of different products. These are drought-resistant plants, which is why they are so common in California. So they're capable of living with less water. So they're able to survive the dry summers that we have in California. And that's one of the reasons why they're so common here. We have 3 families of conifers in California, and that's the Cupressaceae family, the Pinaceae family, and the Taxaceae family. So let's start by taking a look at Cupressaceae. So we have 21 species in this family that are in the California flora. This includes the largest and the tallest trees that we have in California. So the largest being the giant sequoia and the tallest being the coast redwood. Within this family, we have plants that are trees and plants that are shrubs. They're generally resinous, so they exude a sticky resin from their leaves. And they're generally aromatic, meaning that there's a scent to the leaves and the fruits and the wood. The leaves of the plants within this family can be scale-like, like we see in this western juniper in the picture. They can also be awl-like, so those spiky short leaves that we saw in the young western juniper on our field trip, or they can be long and linear and needle-like. The bracts are the little fleshy piece that exudes from each of the scales on the ovulate cones. Recall that we mentioned that in Douglas fir, it's the bracts that look like the little mouse's rear end sticking out between the seed scales. In the Cupressaceae, those bracts are generally fused to the seed scale, so you can't really distinguish between the bract and the seed scale on the ovulate cones. Plants within this family are mostly monoecious, and that means one house. Monoecious means one house. So one house means that one plant houses both the female and male reproductive parts. And we noticed that on Western juniper when we were in the field together. We saw that one plant had both ovulate and pollen cones. And this plant, I can only see the ovulate cones. The bark is fibrous and furrowed, and this family includes some plants that we know, including the incense cedar, Calocedrus decurrens, and also Western juniper, Juniperus occidentalis. The next family we'll take a look at is the Pinaceae. So we have 32 species within this family in California. Like the Cupressaceae, it includes both evergreen shrubs and trees. The leaves of the organisms within this family are sometimes, but not always, in bundles. Recall when we looked at certain pines, like ponderosa pine, that the needles were in bundles of 3 and they were surrounded by little sheaths called fascicles. So that's certainly a good characteristic for identifying organisms within the Pinus genus and the Pinaceae family, although there are some single-leaf pines out there. But not all plants in the Pinaceae family have their leaves in bundles. Some, like the hemlock pictured here and the firs, have their leaves come off the stem singly. So plants within this family can have needle-like or awl-like leaves. They generally have woody seed cones that are persistent. So they remain on the tree for a pretty long time. It can be 1 year, 2 years, or in the case of a species like the knobcone pine, they can remain on the tree for decades. So these ovulate cones are what you think of when you hear the word pine cone, these woody ovulate cones that are produced by organisms within the family Pinaceae. The pollen cones are smaller and they fall off the tree. They are deciduous, so you're much less likely to encounter the pollen cones. In California, we have many examples locally, including the ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa, the Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii, the mountain hemlock, which is pictured here, Tsuga mertensiana, and also firs such as the white fir or Abies concolor. The last family within the Coniferophyta phylum that we'll look at is the Taxaceae. There are 2 species within this family in California, and they are evergreen shrubs or trees, and they are dioecious. So that means 2 houses, meaning that a single plant either is going to generate female or male reproductive organs, but not both. So it's only going to make female reproductive organs, or it's only going to make male reproductive organs. The leaves of the individuals in Taxaceae are not in bundles, as you can see here on this U. The leaves are coming off the stem singly, and the seed is inside this red fleshy structure called an aril. So I want to make the point that this is not a fruit. This is actually part of the seed coat, and it looks kind of berry-like or fruit-like, but these are naked seeds, so we need to keep that in mind. One local example that I hope to be able to show you is the Taxus brevifolia, the U. Okay, now let's take a look at the ginkgo phytes, or the organism, actually there's only one, within the phylum Ginkgophyta. So Ginkgo biloba is the only living member of this phylum. Ginkgo biloba is an interesting plant that you may have heard about. I think you saw a picture of the leaves of Ginkgo biloba as an example of a leaf that has dichotomous venation. It's a really ancient lineage, so it has some pretty unique characteristics that we don't find in many modern plants. Ginkgo biloba is a tree. It gives rise to leaves on short shoots, so it looks like they're kind of clustered together because they're coming off of a really short shoot. The leaves are fleshy and they're deciduous, so they fall off annually in the fall. And the plant is dioecious, so you're either going to have a female plant that makes these seeds or a male plant that does not. Ginkgo biloba is a common street tree. It's highly tolerant of pollution. Unfortunately, the seeds that are generated are really stinky and they're really messy. They fall on the sidewalk and they can stain the sidewalk, and they smell really bad. So the most arborists are hopefully trying to plant the male ginkgos, but eventually you'll find a female ginkgo planted out there somewhere. And yeah, so they produce seeds, and the seeds are a little bit undesirable because of their smell. Okay, now let's take a look at the Cycadophyta, or the cycads. These plants were abundant during the Jurassic period, so if you're a botanist, you might refer to the Jurassic period as the age of the cycads rather than the age of the dinosaurs. We currently have about 140 living species of cycads. These plants are often mistakenly called palms because they have palm-like leaves, like the sago palm that grows in Florida. It's actually a cycad, so it is not a palm. Palms are angiosperms. The cycads are gymnosperms. They give rise to naked seeds, and here we can see some of those seeds being born on this cone-like structure. They are dioecious, so the plant either generates female reproductive parts or it generates male reproductive parts, and they're primarily found in tropical and subtropical environments. The last group of gymnosperms that we'll examine is the phylum Cnidophyta, and there are about 70 species of cnidophytes globally. This group is thought to be the most closely related to the flowering plants, to the angiosperms, and that's because they share some characteristics with the angiosperms, including similarities in their strobili, or their cones, to inflorescences that we see, which is like a group of flowers in some angiosperms. They also have the same kinds of cells called vessels in their xylem and their conducting tissues in the xylem, and they have something called double fertilization. So that means the two sperm nuclei that you saw entering in the pine life cycle, they each fertilize a structure of the megagametophyte. And we'll talk more about double fertilization next week when we take a closer look at the angiosperms. So there are 3 living genera of cnidophytes, and that includes Cnidum, which we see up here. It includes Ephedra, which we see here. Ephedra is also called Mormon tea. It's this plant that has really reduced leaves and photosynthetic stems. And then the most bizarre plant on the planet, called Welwitschia, is also another example of a cnidophyte. So this plant grows in deserts, not in North America, but it grows in deserts, and it has these leaves that grow forever. So they grow out of this strap-like structure in the center, and they just keep growing and splitting and curling. So it's a really unique plant. In California, we have one family of neophytes, the Ephedraceae family. So this includes shrubs that are generally dioecious. So we recall that that means that a certain plant will only produce male or female reproductive parts. They produce pollen cones with stamen-like structures, and stamens are the structures that generate the pollen in the angiosperms. They have jointed stems, kind of like the Equisetaceae family, and they're green in the youth, so the younger ones towards the tips of the plant are green, but they get kind of browner as you go towards the center of the plant where the stems are older. They have tiny scale-like leaves, like we saw in the horsetails, that are mostly not photosynthetic. So the local example that we have in Siskiyou County is Ephedra viridis, and that's what's pictured here. Okay, so in summary, you should understand the unique and shared characteristics of all of the seed plants. Both the gymnosperms and the angiosperms share seeds and pollen and ovules. You should also be familiar with the life cycle of a gymnosperm that we talked through, and you should be familiar with the 4 phyla of gymnosperms and the families that are present within California. So remember those phylums include the Coniferophyta. So in California, we've got the Pinaceae, the Taxaceae, the Cupressaceae. You should be familiar with the characteristics of the Cycadophyta, the Ginkgophyta, and also the Cnidophyta, and our local example, Ephedra. Thanks for watching.